We just learned how the regulations are made. Now let's get into what those regulations actually are. Every organic regulation in all of its bureaucratic glory can be found on the federal ECFR, or Electronic Code of Federal Regulations website. There's a ton here, but the part that has the regulations governing the National Organic Program is Part 205 of Title VII. And if you really want to sound smart and really on your game, referring to the organic rule as Part 205 of Title VII really lands it. There's a link right to these regulations in the lesson notes. We do recommend that you read the whole dang thing. It's really not that long, shouldn't take more than an hour or so to read the Crops and National List of Allowed and Prohibited Substances sections. This is the absolute authority for how the farmers you work with are regulated, so it's important to be at least familiar with each of these sections. You'll see citations to specific regulations in both the Farmer's OSP, the Organic System Plan, and the inspection report. The citation will point right to the regulation that covers the allowability of practices and materials, and it'll look something like this. Let's just run this quick example so you can see how easy it is to find a particular regulation. So 205, 203, C1. That would read, Section 205, 203, subsection C, paragraph 1. Head to this section right now, and let's just scan it until you find the right paragraph. Pretty self-explanatory, right? But it can take a little bit of getting used to. By understanding and accurately referencing the organic regulations, your clients can be confident that your guidance and advice is grounded in the reality of the NOP rules, ensuring that they can get and stay certified organic. As an advisor, it's critical that you understand the regulations so that the advice you give your clients is compliant with the rules and doesn't jeopardize their organic certificate. Farms do lose their organic certificates, and that can mean that they are back to square one with another whole 3-year transition ahead of them. Which is to say, this is really important stuff. But none of us can memorize all of the standards, pages and pages, so let's focus on the 7 most important regulations for you to know, like the back of your hand. These regulations cover the practices, methods, and products that organic farmers use and will come up many times throughout this course. So number 1, organic crops must remain uncontaminated by prohibited substances. For this example, we'll provide the exact language of the standard and then translate it for you. For the next 6, we'll cut right to the chase and break the regulation down into more everyday language. Frankly, some of this can be a little too wordy for its own good. 205, 202C. All right, bear with me. The opening of the section begins. Any field or farm parcel from which harvested crops are intended to be sold, labeled, or represented as organic must, now we jump down to the subsection, which is the C, have distinct defined boundaries and buffer zones such as runoff diversions to prevent the unintended application of a prohibited substance to the crop or contact with a prohibited substance applied to adjoining land that is not under organic management. Relatively clear, but all of the standards can be broken down into much simpler language. This one, 205, 202C, mandates a sufficient buffer between certified organic fields and surrounding land that could result in contamination. That could be your neighbor's conventional field, a roadway that might be sprayed by the local DOT, or even a household that might treat its lawn. The 2 main things that a farmer needs to worry about are both forms of drift, genetic and pesticide. Genetic drift is GE pollen from traded seed that cross-pollinates with an organic crop. Pesticide drift, or overspray, is a pesticide physically drifting from a conventional field onto an organic crop. The regulations say that a farmer needs to take measures to prevent all forms of drift and contamination, usually with a buffer. What buffer means leaves some room to interpretation, though. There isn't a specific prescribed width in the regulations, but 25 feet is generally considered a safe distance. The farmer just has to prove to the certifier that the buffer can sufficiently protect the crop. If there's a physical barrier like a tree line, you might be able to get away with a little bit of a smaller buffer. If you're on the windswept prairie and your neighbor sprays with aerial planes, a bigger buffer is probably going to be necessary. Your certifier will work with you to find the right number. Contamination during harvest and post-harvest handling is also a pretty big deal. We'll cover this in a separate module, but the basic gist is to do a very careful clean out of all of the equipment, track every truck and sale, and carefully label and manage separate storage facilities for your organic and your conventional crops. A quick note, the buffer can be planted into the same crop as the field. That being said, you have to treat it like it's conventional. If you want to do yourself a huge favor, and this is me speaking as both an inspector and a farmer, consider planting all of the buffers to a perennial crop like grasses or pollinator habitat or a windbreak. Because managing a tiny amount of conventional grain and a ton of organic grain is just a huge pain. All right, back on track. Following these standards and setting up a foolproof system to keep contamination from happening can mean the difference between a rejected load and a profitable load of grain. The second regulation that you need to have just a really solid grasp on is that certified organic farmers must use organic seed. There is, however, as of this recording in 2021, still one very specific exception to this rule. Non-organic, untreated seeds can be used if, and this is a big if, an equivalent organically produced variety is not commercially available. If there's an untreated non-GMO variety with agronomic characteristics that a farmer loves and depends on, and a similar organic variety just doesn't exist, they can petition their certifier to allow them to use that preferred variety. However, the farmer, their agronomist or certification manager will need to prove that they've put in the work to find an organic equivalent. This usually means calling 3 seed dealers in a farmer's area and working with them to find an organic replacement. If nothing gets the job done, then a producer can use a conventional variety as long as it is not treated with prohibited substances and not GMO. Quick note, this does not mean just calling your local dealers and asking for your favorite variety of Pioneer corn. They're not going to have an organic version of Pioneer, but they will have organic versions with similar traits. The third core regulation covers crop rotation, specifically that organic farmers absolutely have to have one. The language in the regulations is actually pretty great here and gives farmers and their certifiers quite a bit of freedom as far as what that crop rotation looks like. But here's the key. The rotation must accomplish 4 specific outcomes. Let's just look right at the language they use in the standards. The producer must implement a crop rotation including but not limited to sod, cover crops, green manure crops, and catch crops that provide the following functions that are applicable to the operation. A. Maintain or improve soil organic matter content. We talk about regenerative agriculture a lot. This is where we see it built right into the regulations. B. Provide for pest management in annual and perennial crops. C. Manage deficient or excess plant nutrients. And D. Provide erosion control. Hard to disagree with really any of those outcomes as they're pretty universal goals for any farmer thinking about their crop mix. Crop rotation is the most important tool organic operators have in their toolbox. It's effective crop protection, a fertility program, soil conservation. A certifier will look at the proposed rotation and determine if it checks all of those 4 boxes. Typically, it'll mean that another species needs to be planted between the plantings of the same crop, and most farmers have at least a 3-year crop rotation. In the Midwest, that's likely to include corn and soybeans and maybe a small grain, followed by a cover crop and often some sort of perennial crop. Out west, around here, we might see something more like wheat, followed by yellow peas, and then maybe an oil crop like flax, and then back to wheat or perhaps into a perennial forage. Many of the most successful organic farmers that I've worked with have at least a 5 to 7 year rotation, and some even go longer. We have a whole lesson just on crop rotation, so check that out to learn more. Number 4 is that farmers must implement tillage and cultivation practices that maintain or improve soil conditions and minimize erosion. Every organic system that I'm aware of, other than perennial pasture, will require soil disturbance at some point in the rotation. That said, the how, the what, and the when of that disturbance really matters, and steps have to be taken to minimize any potential damage to the soil. I'm just here to tell you, recreational tillage is not a thing in organics. A focus on minimizing tillage is written right into the regulations. Number 5 is that materials used on a certified organic operation must comply with the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. Note that those words are all in caps. It's the official list of what you can and can't use on an organic farm. In general, naturally occurring inputs, also referred to as non-synthetic, are allowed for use in organics, and synthetic inputs are not allowed. However, the NOP maintains a list of natural materials that are specifically not allowed or that require certain conditions for their use. Similarly, they also have a list of synthetic materials that have been approved for use in organics. So that's officially two lists. We have synthetic materials that are allowed and natural materials that are prohibited. Not all of these official lists are all of the naturally occurring materials that you can use, though. Many, but not all, of these can be found on the list created and managed by the Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI. Those aren't in the regs because, as we've said, it's generally assumed that most naturally occurring materials can be used on an organic farm. But, your certifier still has to check off on every single one of your materials that you're going to use on the organic farm and make sure that your organic system plan reflects those materials. Applying something that's not approved can result in, you guessed it, a farmer getting kicked back to square one. So number 6 builds on the last couple. Organic farmers must manage their cropping system in a way that improves soil organic matter content and does not contaminate the soil or the water. Environmental health it's at the heart of everything in the organic system. Everything from residue management to allowed input rates and timing, including manure, needs to be carefully thought through and calibrated to ensure that excess nutrients and pathogens and residues don't contaminate the soil or the water. Basically, build soil and increase fertility, but do it in a way that doesn't negatively affect anything in the agroecosystem. A solid agricultural practice no matter which system you're talking about. And last but certainly not least, number 7, that a certified organic farmer must use preventative management for pests, weeds, and diseases before applying any allowable pest control substance, be it biological, botanical, or an approved synthetic. The regulation requires prevention before you can react with an organic crop protection, treating allowed synthetic substances and even many biologicals as a last resort. The thinking is that a well-managed, healthy farming system will avoid the need to apply these substances. And honestly, that's been true in my experience observing thousands of organic farms. When they say preventative measures, they mean things like crop rotation, cultural practices like planting disease-resistant varieties, development of habitat for natural enemies of pests, mulching, mowing, grazing, mechanical cultivation, etc. As an advisor, it's important that you look to preventative measures as a first line of defense for your clients' crops. If, and only if, these strategies don't get the job done, will an application of an allowed substance be permitted? So those are the 7 regulations that are most relevant to you and your farmer clients. We've also broken them down into a quick cheat sheet for you available on this lessons page. Always keep in mind that every piece of advice you provide for your organic client must be in compliance with the NOP regulations. If you understand the ins and outs of each of the regulations, you are just an invaluable asset to a transitioning or organic farmer. Letting them farm while knowing that they have someone keeping them on the right side of the regulations. Most importantly, though, remember that the certifier is the final word on organic compliance. Always have your clients notify their certifier in writing about any changes to what they're applying and wait for the thumbs up before making the change on their certified organic fields. Every change has to be documented in their OSP before they implement the practice. Being an organic agronomist has just as much to do with the actual agronomy as it does knowing the framework of the rules and regulations that inform and constrain those agronomic practices. In fact, the regulations are probably best thought of as a codified form of what I like to think of as just good farming. A dedication to continuous improvement, protecting and enhancing natural systems and resources, and working to prevent problems in harmony with that system. Organic rewards farmers for being both good farmers and following the rules. You as an advisor or advocate play a critical role in supporting a farmer in doing both.